And this is part of that Easter series I promised you. This is Easter tide, will be for a few more weeks. And it's a series on the resurrection and salvation. And we're doing this in the midst of our work as a United Methodist Church on Rethink Church, where we're trying to understand what in the world the dynamic of the church is in the 21st century. And how do we verbalize that? How do we conceptualize that? How do we understand that in the deeps of our lives? Last week we talked about salvation and resurrection as that which occurs on this plane. You remember they had a three-story universe. There was heaven up there and earth here and hell beneath. And if you read closely to the story, all the action takes place on this plane. Not later in some other place, but right here. Salvation and resurrection happens right here. Paul, the experience of salvation for him happened in his life, right here, right now. Wasn't something later on, something that was going to happen after death. It was something that went on in life as we experience it right now. Salvation is a state of being. It's not some imagined thing that happens somewhere outside of the realm of reality. It is something that you experience in the deeps of your life. And I rather imagine if you reflect enough upon your life, you will see the etchings of it there. Meeting Christ in your life is something that happens to each and every human being. And we'll preach more about that a little later on. But we're not talking about something outside the realm of our knowledge or our experience. The church and our papas and mamas in the faith, we're talking about something that happened to them as they lived. And that it was an experience that changed everything, that turned their life inside out, upside down. Paul went from being a very religious person who followed all the rules to being a very dynamic person who reached out beyond his parochial boundaries that he had deemed God had placed upon him. To seek people and to associate with people that were on the bad list, was on the outside the list of people you were to associate with. And our papas and mamas in the early church proclaimed that this experience, that this happening in your life was not just for particular religion which they'd come out of, but for everybody. That it was something in our deeps that they were talking about. Now we come to the whole issue of universal salvation, or salvation for all. Something that we don't get clear about because most of us do not study patristics. Patristics about the early fathers of the church in the first 3-4 centuries. And among all of them, Clement, Origen, Ambrose, Justin, all of these classical thinkers that formed our faith, they saw universal salvation as squarely in the heart of the gospel. It wasn't until a priest by the name of Augustine began to think and write in about 354 to 430 that things began to change. He pulled upon his own background outside of faith, which had popularized the notion that the people they didn't agree with would roast in hell, began to pull that through the gospel stories. It wasn't until 553 at the Fifth Ecumenical Council that a resolution was passed that stated they were against universal salvation and that salvation could come only through the church, and that the only way you were going to get it was if they gave it to you. And the church began to amplify that. And by the time the Protestant Reformation occurred, it was still stuck squarely in the craw of the Reformers. Because while they disagreed with Rome, they believed that they had it and they could distribute it and nobody else could. Now, John Wesley, who read the Eastern theologians as well as the Western theologians, began to preach against that. And you need to know that about Wesley and about your own Methodist tradition. And if you need a good reference, go search for Wesley's sermon on the fall of man. He preached it in 1782, in which he proclaims universal salvation is the way it is. So we are knee-deep, if not shoulder-deep, in the understanding of salvation for all. And the modern theologians like Friedrich Schleiermacher and Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Paul Tillich and a whole host of others stand in the midst of that.